I hope your day is going better than whoever's job it was to launch Heroes of Might and Magic 3 on Steam, because they forgot the, game files. They only included a 23 kilobyte dummy file rather than the actual game. Yes, it's been fixed since then, or actually maybe this was a genius marketing tactic to get a bunch of viral coverage of the fact that Heroes of Might and Magic 3, the complete edition, is now available on Steam. Previously, they only had the incomplete HD edition rather than the GOG version, which actually was the complete edition. So there's that. This is all probably to drum up interest in the Heroes of Might and Magic 3 remaster that's coming out later that they announced anyway. I have my doubts about a 3D version of that game being necessary, but let's move on to other bigger news topics. Gears of War E-Day has announced that it has RTX mega geometry support for full detail nanite ray tracing. Now, we've got some things showing off what this is. Basically, in a lot of ray tracing scenes, you're using a BVH structure which has a lot less detail than the actual fully realized detail of the game in the scene, especially in an Unreal Engine 5 game with nanite, all of that. So we've got some sliders here where you can look at how mega geometry on, you get a whole bunch more detail in the scene compared to off. We need to think about, performance. Hopefully performance still manages to hang in there. But I do have to mention that when you actually look at the scene fully rendered rather than the debug view, yes, you can see some improvements. It does look better, but I can't help but feel like this is one of those times that highlights, there's this growing feeling like game graphics are getting to a level where, yes, they're getting better, but it's harder to appreciate those subtle details that are being added, especially with the performance cost that they take. That being said, this is a impressive technology, and it does get you better, detail on the shadows of the individual bars of the shopping cart there, etc. So there are definitely visible improvements. But yeah, it really does kind of make me think about, okay, if the performance cost is big for this, which maybe it's not, we'll need to performance test it for sure. It does kind of make you wonder about, it's not that they aren't pushing game graphics further and further and further, but it's like at some point, a while back, I think we hit diminishing returns a little bit on that. Anyway, Xbox has announced physical game discs can now unlock digital copies. Now, for now, this is mostly, a console thing. However, with the next generation Xbox Project Helix being heavily rumored to be at least more like a PC. Now, how open that is still a question, but if you're somebody with some older Xbox games, basically you just insert the disc into an Xbox One or Series X console, and now you can associate the digital license for that game with your account. Of course, if you then use that disc in somebody else's Xbox on somebody else's account, it will transfer that license away from you. But it doesn't destroy the disc. The disc can still be used. So I think this is overall a good thing, and the test begins through the Xbox Insider program on August 31st, and apparently it will support thousands of games, although not every single game. I think overall, especially if this ends up getting access to games that were previously Xbox only on PC, this seems like a good thing to me overall. Now, a bad thing is that it looks like Apex Legends has confirmed that RX 9070 XT cards are crashing on AMD Adrenalin version 26.8.1, but that rolling back to a previous driver version does seem to fix that problem. It appears that it's the Japanese Apex Legends account that has confirmed this, but it seems to be confirmed. So if you are an Apex Legends player and have a 9070 XT, or maybe this is also applying to other 9000 series cards, and you were experiencing some crashing, maybe roll back those drivers. Now, speaking of rolling things back out, we had the RTX 3060 12GB suddenly come back into production in the, shoring up the lower end with something with a bit more VRAM from NVIDIA, even if it's an older architecture. However, they already launched at a pretty high price, and it's looking like prices are already up 45% just since the relaunch, now costing significantly more than the 5050, which is faster, albeit with less VRAM. Looking like $480 currently on Newegg compared to the $299 on the RTX 5050. Now, I want to talk about the fact that there's a couple of games launching tomorrow. I definitely won't have time to test out the performance for both of them, especially not day one. I mean, maybe if I go to the weekend, I'll have time to get something in. But we can talk about their system requirements. So we have Star Wars Zero Company, which seems to be kind of an XCOM-style tactical game, which personally I'm a huge fan of. So this is one that is very interesting to me, and I do also like Star Wars, although, I used to be really into Star Wars, and then the flooding of Star Wars media, etc., I just, not as exciting as it used to be, at least for me, but still interested. And looks like an Open Critic, we're getting a 90% critics recommend average, so looking pretty high there. And we have some PC system requirements for it. But also launching tomorrow is Resonance, A Plague Tale Legacy. Now, I played the previous Plague Tale games, and the one that came out a few years back was a pretty solid game. This one seems to take a bit of a different direction with the gameplay. Is getting a 85% critics recommend average on Open Critic, so also looking like a pretty decent launch here. So between the two, I might have to pick which one I either want to play or benchmark and or both, but we do have system requirements. Now, Star Wars Zero Company is using Unreal Engine 5, so there's that. But whereas Resonance, A Plague Tale Legacy, as far as my research points to, is that they're still using their in-house engine, which really looked great for the time when they launched A Plague Tale Requiem a few years back. So interesting stuff. Now, the PC system requirements for Resonance, A Plague Tale Legacy also are posting the frame rates you need for ultra, no upscaling, no frame generation at 1080p, 60 FPS, 3060 Ti or 6700 XT. A little bit more powerful than what you see in game consoles, so it looks like maybe they're targeting sort of what they're doing on consoles-ish, and they're asking for a Ryzen 5 5600X or a Core i5 12400F with 16 gigabytes of RAM. And saying 8 gigabytes of VRAM should be fine for 1080p Ultra settings. Again, Ultra, no upscaling, no frame generation. Now, I still need to test the game to see if this is actually correct, but I would say that feels pretty good, especially because the game does look pretty solid. Again, their previous entry really stood out for the time, and it looks like they have pushed things ahead even since then. So I think the game does look pretty good overall, especially given those requirements. And I really love to see studios that can push out a game engine that they make themselves that can still compete graphically with something like an Unreal Engine 5 game and maybe have some better performance profiles. We'll have to see how it actually comes out. And they're saying that on the minimum side of things for 1080p 30 FPS, but still at no upscaling or frame generation, albeit at low graphics settings, they're saying that you should be able to get by with an RX 5500 XT or a GTX 1060 and asking for 6 gigabytes of VRAM. CPUs on the minimum, so probably for 30 FPS, Ryzen 3 3100 or i3 12100. And if you're wanting 60 FPS in the game, it's looking like you'd want a 5600X or a 12400F. So I think that looks pretty solid if we want to look at where your GPU might fall relative to that 3060 Ti for 1080p Ultra 60 FPS, assuming it's accurate. If I set that as the baseline here, that's a little less powerful than a 5060, so a 5060 should also be in pretty good shape for that. 3070 is a bit more powerful, 9060 XT is a bit more powerful. 5060 Ti, we're now getting to like 30% more powerful. Maybe you could start pushing the resolution up to like 1440p. Of course, you could also use upscaling. And then if you had something on the weaker side, if you have like a 5050, you're definitely below the recommended, but not by like a ton. If you're on a 2080, you're kind of a similar ballpark there. 3060 is definitely weaker than a 3060 Ti, so might have to reduce settings, maybe use a little bit of upscaling. And as we scroll down to the minimum spec for that 30 FPS, low settings, 1080p, GTX 1066 gigabyte, we are talking a decade-old card at this point. That was $299 when it launched, so pretty cool that you can still play a big, somewhat graphically demanding game as it launches new. And let's see, they're pairing that with a 5500 XT, which does seem to make sense from a performance standpoint. They're generally fairly similar. So overall, that all looks pretty solid. No upscaling or frame generation crutch to hit the targets either. And like I said, the released footage of the game does look pretty solid graphically to me, by all accounts, and so did the previous game. Now, how about the Star Wars Zero Company front? Well, we did get system requirements for this a while back as well. So with Star Wars Zero Company, the minimum spec is a 5600 XT or ARC B580 or GTX 1080. So it certainly has a heavier minimum spec than what we're seeing from Plague Tale. That's for 1080p 30 FPS low settings, by the way. They don't mention whether that's with upscaling enabled. It doesn't say it's using upscaling, but it doesn't always mean it's not when we see system requirements charts, so do keep that in mind. So if we compare that to Plague Tale, just for fun, they're completely different types of games, but it's just we're talking about both, so might as well. Like they're going from a 1060 up to a 1080 for that minimum spec. So that's a 50% performance jump as we go into Star Wars Zero Company. I almost spaced out on the name again right there. So yeah, definitely asking for a bit more there. Now, if you take a look at the recommended spec. Now, one thing to note here for their recommended spec is it's for 1440p 60 FPS at high settings. Most games list 1080p for their recommended spec, so I think it's pretty cool that they're giving us 1440p 60 FPS at high settings. Now, again, they don't specify this is using upscaling anywhere. That doesn't mean it isn't, and it is an Unreal Engine 5 game, so it could be. But the high preset in Unreal Engine 5 often does perform a lot better than the Epic or Ultra settings, whatever the game chooses to call them, and I do think it tends to be the most optimal preset for performance for visuals ratio. Now they're saying for that 1440p 60 FPS at high settings, they would recommend a 3080 or 7800 XT. They're also saying system memory at 32 gigabytes, which is a bit high. I would hope you could get by with 16, and honestly, UE5 can often be pretty RAM and VRAM efficient. It's not always super performant, but it's not necessarily just like flowing over RAM requirements. So I wonder if they could have got by with 16 and they're just listing 32 because that's what was in the system that they were testing with. That RTX 3080 and 7800 XT is certainly a step up from their GTX 1080 minimum requirement. If we take a look at that, you can scroll up, maybe see where you fall along the way. If we go all the way up to a 3080, sure, the 30 series was a while ago, but performance hasn't gone bonkers since then exactly. We don't get the generational uplifts that we used to. So that 3080 here is still pretty much on par with like a 4070, or honestly, even a 5070 is only about 14% faster on average. So yeah, 7800 XT does make sense to pair, as they do generally have about the same performance. 6800 XT is right there if you're on an older generation. 5060 Ti is in the same kind of performance ballpark. Not clear whether or not 8 gigabytes of VRAM would be enough, but that's kind of the general performance ballpark that we would be there. Now, Star Wars Zero Company, we do have a gameplay trailer, and I'll say that, graphically looks fine. I wouldn't say it's like a UE5 game that pushes things the farthest I've ever seen or anything like that. But I'm certainly interested in kind of the turn-based tactical gameplay genre here, so maybe that'll be a pretty cool one. Might check that out to play. Like I said, I might have time to test one or both or none of these. I'm very, very busy right now outside of YouTube things. So we'll see what I have time for. But I hope for both of these games, they remember to include the game files when they launch on Steam. That's what I've got for you guys today. Hope you found the video useful and or interesting, and you all have an excellent day.